Hello and welcome to The Truth About Wealth with John and Michael Parise of Copper Beach Financial Group. I'm Wendy McConnell. Hi, guys. How you doing?
Hello, Wendy.
Hey, Wendy. How you doing today?
Oh, I'm good. It's good to see you guys as always. It looks like we have a guest.
Yes, a returning guest today, Mr. David Warren from Bridgeford Trust. How you doing, David?
Oh, great. Always happy to be with you guys. And we were joking the first time we did this, nobody had to see my face. So I apologize to your viewers. You have to see my face this time around.
That's all right. You look very well put together. I'm sure it'll be
well, it's the makeup.
So, David, well, first off, thank you for being on again. I've heard through the years since, I think it's been probably a year at least since you were last on the podcast, but I have to say it's one of our most referred podcasts, honestly, because we're hearing so much good feedback from our last podcast we did with you, and also because the topics that we cover with you are, I think, very pertinent to what's going on,
very important
in today's day and age. So thank you for being back on.
Oh, no, absolutely. It's a pleasure. And same thing with our podcast. You were put on our program as well, and it's gotten a lot of listens. And I think it is a testament to things that we both talk about, the three of us, and what our firms are so passionate about in terms of what we do for our families. I think it resonates with our listeners. So thank you for supporting our podcast as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great podcast, by the way. So if anybody's watching, please check out the Bridgeford Trust podcast. I think you can get it on all the Apple, Spotify, all that stuff. And I know your website, I think, too, I saw it on as well. So,
sure.
Yeah,
thank you.
Please check it out. So today, David, I know we were chatting a little bit earlier. There's so much we can really talk about, but I think one of the things that we were actually in looking at your podcast and some of the videos that you had done, this concept of a purpose trust is something that I think really caught our eye. It was something, frankly, we had never really paid a lot of attention to or heard of a lot, or anybody really talk about. And so I think when we were talking about, hey, what do we want to talk to David about, that was the one thing that we both said, oh yeah, that'll be a cool topic. So we can talk about anything, but I think that would be one area that we just felt would be a great topic to educate our listeners about. Does that work for you?
Oh, absolutely. It's a pretty powerful planning technique. And I always joke when I talk to people, what's the purpose of a purpose trust, right? And happy to talk
right.
about that.
Yeah. What is that again?
What's the purpose of a purpose trust? No, it's pretty amazing. And not a lot of states even have purpose trust legislation. And in concept, it's not complicated, as you saw. It's just a way to have a trust exist for a reason or a purpose, and not so much for the direct benefit of a named beneficiary. And so the question might be, why does that matter? Well, often people want to establish trusts, and you see this most commonly in a charitable world, where people establish a charitable trust for a purpose, which is a charitable purpose, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. This is similar in that you can establish the trust and you can have it be for a particular reason. Could be to exist to take care of pets in perpetuity. It could be, it could exist to hold a private trust company, which is what we see all the time. And really the whole idea is that the monies are to support a concept. I'll give you probably the most salacious concept I've ever seen. And we were open to this. Boy. Oh yeah. You might want to sit down for this.
Yeah. I'm already sitting there.
Yeah, geez. Years ago, we were asked to get involved with cryogenics. And what cryogenics is, for those of you who might recall the joke Disney on Ice. Remember that joke with Disney on Ice, where he paid a lot of money to have his body frozen at his death, with the idea that at some point modern medicine would get to the point that they could fix what it is that ultimately took his life. So Disney continues to be deep frozen somewhere in the United States. And so there's been a whole society of people that do this, and they need and want the actual body and the actual funds to be cared for through virtue of a dynastic trust that we do. And we talked about that on your last podcast. So getting to my point, the purpose of that trust isn't to support a named beneficiary because that person has passed away. The purpose of that trust is to exist in perpetuity, to care for him to the extent that he will be able to be brought back to life. And it's also there to maintain the the technology to keep him frozen. And so that's a long-winded, salacious way to describe how these trusts can be used, and they're very creative. And what I love most about them too is it also still brings the power of asset protection and privacy and the tax component of it too that we talked about in your last podcast. But you didn't expect me to talk about people frozen, did you, on this podcast today?
No, it's like a sci-fi.
But I get the concept. I mean, it's a purpose.
Yeah,
it's designed that way, and the trust accommodates. That's great.
So so David, if I'm following this concept, this is almost it almost sounds like this is a way to create a trust almost outside of the traditional way one would create a trust. It's almost more of an open-ended concept, right? Almost like you don't quite know if you're going to create this dynasty trust that might last for hundreds of years, but you don't necessarily know what's going to be, like who's going to be around in 100 years from now or even further. It's almost like an open-ended trust concept, it sounds like to me. Is that an accurate description of it?
I think that's perfect. Yeah. And I think that's why, particularly very large families love that. And they love the idea of having a purpose continue forever that they may be passionate about. They don't want to use the charitable, route. And you're exactly right. And the nice thing, as we all know, the dynasty trust lives forever. So, $100 million hypothetically that's put in trust to keep this person frozen. We'll use that as our continued example. Is of course never subjected to estate tax because it's a dynasty trust and never forced to distribute. And that's sort of the beauty of it too, Michael, because how do you force a trust to distribute when it's for a purpose, right? So it has to be set up as a dynasty trust. So it's it all ties modern trust law into a nice neat bow or a box in a bow because it needs all of the modern trust law tools, I believe, to function properly. The purpose trust, to function properly.
So now is South Dakota the only jurisdiction where these purpose trusts can be formed, or is there a particular reason why South Dakota just fits better here?
Yeah, South Dakota, and like a lot of the other areas where they've decided to be leaders, they enacted, I would argue, the most progressive, well, not me, but people smarter than me are arguing it's the most progressive, meaning that it allows for a whole myriad of purposes, somewhat myopic, including this cryogenic piece, that other statutes wouldn't necessarily allow. And so South Dakota wanted to be the preeminent provider of these trusts. And where you see them most frequently is in the private trust company space. And as we talked about before, of course, private trust company is a privately owned trust company created for the benefit of one family, and then that is dropped inside a purpose trust that lives forever. And the purpose of that trust is to maintain forever the family private trust company. And so there's lots of reasons why, the purpose trust gels with all the other reasons why South Dakota just has ascended to what we believe still to be the top trust jurisdiction in the nation.
David, there's another example that I just thought about. We have several clients in the past that said, listen, I own this piece of real estate. It's a beach property or it's a lake property or property has been in the family for generations. They want to keep that property for the kids and grandkids, and they want to keep it in a trust. So that would be a perfect example of you could design this purpose trust specifically for that piece of real estate.
That's a great example, absolutely. And you're being close to the Jersey Shore, and I grew up on the Jersey Shore. We see a lot at Bridgeford of shore houses a lot down New Jersey coast and sitting in a purpose trust in South Dakota that we administer. That's a great point. Yep, it's a great point.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I don't mean to interrupt you. And it's interesting to me as well as how few lawyers are aware of the concept, and I think there's an education process. So I'm really glad that you know about this and looked at this on the website, because I'm a little bit on a crusade. Sounds like a little bit of a dramatic word, but there are so many things now that we can do in modern trust law, including these purpose trusts, that still are not widely known. And I think we have a lot of education to do for our clients and the advisors we work with on this and other concepts.
Yeah, we've talked in the past, and we live in this world with you, is that asset protection is a theme that's hot in the markets over the last few years. People are concerned about protecting the assets they've created. A lot of wealth has been created over the last 10 or 15 years, and there's more of a focus on that thought process. Like, okay, I built this massive amount of wealth, and it could be any amount. Asset protection, again, why would I not want to protect what I built for the generations potentially? As you know, we create 100-year families, so your trust model, working with your firm, has always been a focus of ours, trying to create these very flexible trusts that accommodate our families for this conversation, a specific purpose, which would be an interesting conversation to have with clients going forward. Because as Michael just said, we're aware of those concepts, but we never really discussed it as an option. We always deal with typical trusts with you that they're asset protected, they're discretionary designs, and they have specific beneficiaries. So it can be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up asset protection. I mean, it continues to be red hot, as you said. I can tell you the phone calls I'm having with large families in the last 6 months. That's
crazy.
The first thing they're asking about. And I can tell you, we just did a presentation on this very point in Orange County, or for Step LA in California. And the topic was, in uncertain and troubling times, the unsettled. In unsettled times, settling the right trust is really the right way to go. And I didn't say that correctly. That wasn't the title. But the idea is that we're facing some unprecedented, really crises, and not to wade into politics or certainly take a position, but unquestionably, everybody, but particularly very wealthy families, are becoming very squeamish in the United States, and they're worried about things and thinking and asking me questions about potential outcomes that I've never heard before. And, I always say I'm 51. I consider myself young, but old enough to have perspective. I was a political science major and a lawyer by training, and I'm seeing things I've never seen before. So I have families that are so singularly concerned about protecting their assets in what appears to be some really unsettled times. Yeah, I was going to ask you your perspective. I have families they want to know, can they put an asset protection trust together in South Dakota and have the assets held in Switzerland? The answer is, of course. And they're worried about, quite frankly, whatever happens with the election, could there be a complete collapse of the U.S. government? A little dramatic, but
we work with a lot of clients' law firms and their other advisors, as you know, our structure, and what we're talking about, I think, is the next level of planning that maybe the legal teams or the CPAs or the financial specialists behind the scenes with families aren't quite getting there with the thought process, because I think we think 100 years, that's really what our model is. So we're more apt to think about, how do I protect this asset for that length of time, and how important is that to you as a family? And when we bring it up, they go, absolutely, it's real important. So, and then Michael, as you know, is a high-flying attorney here. He works very closely with our family's attorneys to introduce these concepts, and we help design these documents. And you've worked with us for a while now. You know how we work collaboratively with the legal teams in your firm successfully. So it needs a team approach, and I think that's what we're getting at. And most of these families don't have that collaboration we talked about in our last podcast.
Absolutely.
The focus we always have at Copper Beech is that collaboration piece, which we think is a missing link in the market. And you could probably confirm that. You work with a lot of financial planning organizations or family offices, and I think you could agree on that topic.
Completely. And that's what I think makes you special. And we talked a lot about that on both podcasts. I mean, you are asking questions that I know most aren't. And you're getting into topics that I know most aren't. And you're driving planning that I know most aren't. And so that's why it's such a pleasure to work with you, because you've embraced all these ideas. And you look at things like, what's a purpose trust and how can that help my family? And I think that's absolutely what differentiates you guys in the marketplace. And that's what your clients are. I've met your clients. That's what they tell me all the time, that you really are doing something special in a different way that it's hard for them to find elsewhere.
Yeah. And the one kind of related to this conversation, David, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, and I wanted to make sure we touched on it. We did touch on it a little bit on our last podcast, but you had mentioned a little earlier about how you can have somebody, with assets owned in Switzerland that has a South Dakota trust. And one of the things that we've seen over the years is, having, it gets back to collaboration, about having the right attorney that would understand how to, number one, how to draft these trusts. But this comes up all the time with clients where they might be located, let's say, here in the United States. They're in a particular state, And when we review their trust documents and their estate plan, they have a trust in, let's say they live in California. They have a California-based trust because the attorney that they worked with drafts the trust in California. And we all know that might not be the best domicile to have that trust if you are more concerned about asset protection or creating dynasty trusts or things along those lines. So can you talk a little bit about, maybe just from an education standpoint to our listeners, about that concept in general, right? I mean, you can have a South Dakota trust and live really anywhere, maybe not anywhere, but that kind of concept. You don't have to have it in your state.
Absolutely. And I chuckled when you use California as an example. And what I'm about to say is pretty aggressive, but I do believe it. And I cannot conjure up a particular good reason to ever create a California trust for a California resident. And so to your point, Michael, certainly residents of any state or any citizens of the world, they can establish a trust in South Dakota. But in particular, your example in California, yeah, there's no impediment to establishing a trust in South Dakota to take advantage of asset protection, some extremely compelling tax aspects that we talked about on the last podcast we can get into again. And I will take your observation a step further, and I have some research to support this. There's cases, one out of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and in another case that's working its way up through the North Carolina Supreme Court to the Supreme Court. And statutory guidance, or I should say maybe treatise guidance, and Scott's on Trust and the restatements of Third on Trust and different sort of seminal works that I learned in law school, where the very real argument is made that there's a fiduciary duty actually to select a more favorable trust jurisdiction. Because if you think about it, it makes sense. The job of a trustee, and I would argue a lawyer too, is to create a trust that best protects the assets. That's what that's the fundamental concept of a trust, is to protect the trust from protect the trust assets. And this Massachusetts Supreme Court case, about 3 or 4 years old, said definitively that there may be a fiduciary duty for a trustee to take a trust out of Massachusetts, which we all know is not a favorable trust jurisdiction, or California, which is even worse, and put it in a state like South Dakota or Delaware or Nevada, which is clearly a better trust jurisdiction in multiple different ways. So I've kind of crafted this presentation, and I have 6 or 7 slides where I very adamantly make the argument, and I say a scary word, and Michael knows the scary word because I'm a lawyer too. Nobody wants to hear malpractice, but I wonder when the case is going to come down where a trial court says to lawyer and or trust company, look, for tax reasons, asset protection reasons, privacy reasons, and a whole myriad of other reasons, why would you ever suggest a California trust? And the fact that you did so, and the trust assets were seized or the trust was pierced because you chose the wrong jurisdiction, why isn't that malpractice? I mean, Michael, I put it back to you as a lawyer. I mean, if a lawyer knows that by simply putting a trust in Nevada or South Dakota that does not have a state income tax, if they know that, but they tell their client, you're fine in California, and they pay 13% year over year on undistributed income, I mean, it's pretty easy to do the math to establish damage. So, Michael, from your perspective, with your lawyer hat on, I mean, how do you approach that conversation, or how do you approach that concept? Yeah. I suppose
that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going to the Heckerling conference, which I know both you and I attend annually, and I think this is going back probably 10 years ago. That question came up. I forget the gentleman's name who was speaking, but he was more of an asset protection focused attorney, and he kind of put that out to the audience exactly as you described it, right? In terms of, if you know that these benefits exist out there, do you have a fiduciary duty or a duty of care to your client to be able to move the trust or assets into that jurisdiction for all the reasons that you mentioned? So, I mean, I haven't had too many of those conversations with attorneys. And again, I think that the challenge that we see, or that the attorneys, are a local attorney that are maybe licensed in, I don't mean to just pick on California, but if they're licensed in California, they feel like that's the only type of trust that they have the capability of drafting, right? And so they don't feel comfortable moving to Nevada.
So as you know, we launched what we call rep office in Newport Beach, California. So I'm there all the time, and I only interrupting because I want to affirm what you're saying. I hear that all the time from California attorneys. That, well, this is how I've done it. I'm not a South Dakota attorney. I don't have an obligation to understand this stuff because I'm not licensed in one of those states. And I mean, I it blows my mind. And I said, is that really what you're going to tell the judge? You're going to have an obligation to understand how asset protection works in South Dakota. I mean, I don't think a judge is going to be sympathetic to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we've worked with some attorneys on this particular issue that maybe have had those statements. And I know that there's ways in which, they could either counsel with in this case, South Dakota attorney, right, to be able to say, okay, does this trust that I'm drafting fit South Dakota law to achieve these benefits? And that's how they protect themselves by they're not practicing law in a unlicensed in another jurisdiction, but they're giving that protection to the client, which I think is a great way to go about it, really.
So David, what you're talking about, which is interesting on the fiduciary side of this, I'm thinking out of the box here. I always like to use the word paradigm shift. In our world, we're shifting that paradigm, have been for years. And you're doing the same thing in your world. I mean, that could be catastrophic for folks that have trusts in states are not strong in asset protection, and they're not aware of the risk associated with that trust potentially for their families. That should be a serious conversation in addition to general estate planning techniques and using trusts. That should be a conversation, even if they don't have a trust. It should be a forefront conversation. But if they do have trusts that have been around for, some families we see trusts been around for years.
Oh yeah,
they have to revisit those to say, wait a minute, should I replace this trust or reposition this trust in a different domicile to protect these assets that I put in this other trust? I mean, so that should be a deep conversation. So people listening to this podcast, if you have these type of legacy trusts or dynasty trusts, it should be a good conversation with your attorney at the risk of having that trust in that particular state. I think that's. I'm not trying to open a can of worms here, but would you agree with that?
No, that's I think you said it perfectly. And actually, to me, it strikes at the very heart of what I know that you and Michael and our firms are so passionate about, which is avoiding conflicts of interest. I know that is how and why you started Copper Beach, how and why Bridgeford exists, because we saw way too much conflicts of interest. So let's use your state for a minute, as New Jersey. If there is determined, and I'm happy to share for you to share with your listeners the what I rely on from a resource perspective. But if we assume for a moment, as the lawyers say, if you assume arguendo that in fact there's a fiduciary duty that on the trustee, on the part of the trustee, right? So think about the implications of that in light of what you just said, John. So if a New Jersey trust company has a fiduciary duty to do and act in the best interest of these trust assets and protect them, then shouldn't they be looking to move those trusts into South Dakota or Delaware or another jurisdiction? And we agree, the three of us, of course they should. But will a New Jersey trust company do that? Of course not, because they don't have trust powers in those jurisdictions. And what is that called? 2 words, conflict of interest. 3 words, conflict of interest, which is, I think the very heart of what continues to be wrong with our industry. And I know the three of us are very passionate about that. And so John and Michael, comment on that.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll throw it to the attorney.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, the analogy that I make for those, if anybody's watching this and still a little confused, it's really like corporations. I mean, you can form a corporation in Delaware, and all the largest companies are usually domiciled there. I think that's a really good analogy. It's the same thing with trust. You can have your trust domiciled and affiliated and associated with and under the laws of a South Dakota trust, just like in Delaware for corporations, right? Which is a very common one. So that's the analogy. I mean, yeah, it's going to be interesting who opens that door, David, if anybody does, in terms of liability, suing that New Jersey trustee and that trust company. I don't know. I'm not a litigator, and I'm happy I'm not a litigator. On these issues.
Says that all the time. Because I'm glad I do what I do.
I can see it. I see it happening for sure.
And by full disclosure, okay, John. Full disclosure, we live in New Jersey, obviously, and David is our trustee, so we do have trust with David because we recognize that same issue that we wanted asset protection in our documents, so we work very closely personally with David and his firm.
Well, but we're all still Jersey boys at heart, regardless of where our trusts are located.
That's right.
Let's say that.
I
was going to say, I used to be a litigator, so sometimes I feel like going back to practice law just so I could find that case to sue a New Jersey bank. But I don't want to do that anymore. I don't think like that anymore. I'm a nicer person.
All right, so we circle the wagons. I think this is a great conversation today. If we circle the wagons, everybody that has any decent amount of wealth, and if they're considering using trusts, they should try to find a firm that's sophisticated in that arena and discuss different states and jurisdictions that have the best benefit for that trust structure for my family and for whatever purpose, as we started the conversation today, to focus on. So I think anybody's listening and considering trust, you have to kind of check and wait a minute, there's a lot more here I need to know. So I would go back to your firm and start having that dialogue with the attorneys you're working with. Michael, you have any thoughts on that? I think you would agree.
100% agree. I think that hopefully this is helpful for you listeners out there. If you have a trust that, maybe you put in place years ago, and maybe your financial and family circumstances are different now than they were when you drafted it, now is maybe a good time to go back and maybe have some of these conversations with your advisors to see if there's maybe a better place to place it.
Yeah, the last conversation we had in the last podcast, I closed with the same thought, is that I think you need to push your advisors. It's too important of an issue, whether it's estate planning, tax planning, financial planning. You should push back at your current advisors to make sure you're getting the best advice possible, because there's too much going on around the world. There's too much risk exposure from every aspect of life you could ever imagine. It's more important today, after being in this business almost 40 years. It's a huge difference today than it was even 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. So I think people get a little lazy. It's in place. It's okay. No, it's not. So I think and I recommend double checking with those documents and work with your law firm. And if you need to reach out to a South Dakota Trust Company, David's the guys that'll handle it for you. But most certainly, my recommendation is revisit what you have in place.
No, I appreciate that. And, you should be congratulated, John, both of you, but you in particular. I remember us talking about the story of Copper Beech and your passion for creating the paradigm shift. And that's exactly why we wanted to do Bridgeford too.
But we have a lot of fun, don't we?
Oh, we certainly do. And your clients are fantastic.
We like thinking out of the box. That's the benefit of our two companies. Mike, any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, this is great. David, thank you again. This has been a great episode, and it's always great to talk to you. And I know we'll be doing this soon again, hopefully. So thanks so much for being a part of it again.
Thank you, David. Always a pleasure, sir.
Thanks for the friendship and collaboration, guys.
Gotcha.
All right. Michael, how can people get in touch if they have some more questions?
Well, you can contact, if you want to contact Copper Beech, you could reach us on social media platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook. Our website address is www.cbfgllc.com. And David, maybe if you don't mind, if somebody wants to contact Bridgeford, how do they get a hold of you?
Certainly. Please do. BridgefordTrustCompany.com. Very simple. And also we have a whole myriad of digital media tools for families to look at. We have a YouTube channel where there's educational videos. We have everything's geared towards education and not sales. So there's a whole lot there. We have of course, our podcast series, which you can go to and listen if you haven't, to my interview with these fine gentlemen. And we have about 50 episodes there now too, and also some webinars. So please, would love to, if you have any questions, take a look, and I'm happy to be available at any time.
Great, David. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, all of you, for being here today, and thank you for listening. Please like, follow, and share this podcast with your friends. Until next time, I'm Wendy McConnell.
Thank you for listening to the Truth About Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Copper Beech Financial Group. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.
This material is for informational purposes only. Neither APFS nor its representatives provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. Please consult your own tax, legal, or accounting professional before making any decisions. Copper Beech is not affiliated with American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolios Advisors, Inc. Securities offered through American Portfolio Financial Services, Inc., a member of FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory and financial planning services offered through American Portfolio Advisors, Inc., an SEC-registered investment advisor. These opinions are subject to change at any time without notice. Any comments or postings are provided for informational purposes only and do not constitute an offer or a recommendation to buy or sell securities or other financial instruments. Readers should conduct their own review and exercise judgment prior to investing. Investments are not guaranteed, involve risk, and may result in a loss of principal. Past performance does not guarantee future results. Investments are not suitable for all types of investors. Copper Beech is an unaffiliated entity of American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolios Advisors, Inc. Any opinion expressed in this forum is not the opinions of American Portfolio Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolio Advisors, Inc., and have not been reviewed by the firm for completeness or accuracy. American Portfolios and Copper Beech Financial Group are not affiliated with any other named business entities mentioned.